Let's cut right to it. There's a question that's going to shape the future of clinical trials, and it's this. Can the Apple Watch, a device on literally millions of wrists, actually be trusted in a professional healthcare setting? Today, we're going to separate the hype from the reality and dive into the hard evidence.
This quote just hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? We have all these people wearing devices that track every single heartbeat, every step. But without rigorous scientific validation, that huge sea of data is basically just noise. So the real challenge isn't collecting data anymore. It's proving that the data is good enough to make critical health decisions.
And that leads to the multi-million-dollar question for anyone designing a modern study. When you pull data from a consumer wearable, can you really, truly call it clinical grade? It's a question that can make or break your trial, and assuming all data is created equal, well, that's a massive risk.
Fortunately, we don't have to guess. We now have a powerful answer, and it's grounded in this huge number. This isn't just one study. We're talking about a landmark meta-analysis published in Nature's NPJ Digital Medicine, which looked at data from over 430,000 participants. Now, that is the kind of scale we need to get real clarity.
You see, this landmark study gives us a much-needed reality check on what the Apple Watch can and can't do. It helps us solve this data daily use dilemma by systematically separating the clinically valid signals from all that consumer-grade noise.
The sheer scope of this analysis is really what gives its findings so much weight. The researchers looked at 82 different studies, covering 14 distinct health metrics. So this isn't just a small snapshot. It's a comprehensive panoramic view of the device's performance. Okay, so let's start with the good news. The first area where the analysis gives a big green light is cardiac monitoring. This is where the Apple Watch really proves its worth and shows some serious potential for clinical use.
And the really crucial number here is 0.91. That's a specificity for detecting atrial fibrillation, or AFib. So what does that actually mean? Well, in simple terms, it means the watch is excellent at correctly identifying when a person does not have AFib. It generates very few false alarms, which is absolutely critical for any kind of screening tool.
And this brings us to the practical takeaway. Because of that super high specificity, the Apple Watch is a totally viable tool for cardiac safety monitoring. This is especially true in decentralized trials, where you need reliable, continuous oversight without having to drag patients into a clinic all the time.
Okay, now let's talk about heart rate. The average error, what scientists call the mean bias, is tiny. We're talking less than 1 beat per minute off. That's fantastic. But, and this is a big but, look at the limits of agreement. This shows that for any single reading, the error could be almost 7 beats per minute higher or lower than the real value. So, while it's accurate on average, you definitely have to think about that variability depending on what you're using it for.
Now we've got to pivot to the areas that require a lot more caution. For respiratory and metabolic metrics, the analysis gives a clear yellow light. This is where that line between a fun consumer gadget and a clinical-grade tool gets really, really stark. Just take a look at this chart for blood oxygen, or SpO2. The limits of agreement are between -4 and +4%. For a healthy person, that might not sound like a lot. But for a patient with a respiratory condition, a drop from 95% to 91% is a major clinical event. An error margin this wide just makes the metric too unreliable for making those kinds of critical calls.
So the bottom line is this. For now, using the Apple Watch's SpO2 sensor for your primary or critical respiratory endpoints in a clinical trial, it's just not a good idea. The risk of getting inaccurate data is simply too high.
And what about calorie tracking? I mean, it's one of the most popular features on the watch, right? But the science says it's not ready for prime time. The study found that the error rates for energy expenditure are not only big, but they're also all over the place, really inconsistent. That makes it unsuitable for efficacy outcomes in trials looking at things like metabolism, diet, or exercise.
So beyond these specific metrics, the analysis pointed to a deeper, more complicated issue, a kind of hidden variable that can sneak in and introduce bias into your data. And it's rooted in the user's own body.
This is what's known as hidden bias. It happens when factors that you're not even tracking systematically throw off your measurements. With wearables, it could mean that data from one group of people is just fundamentally less accurate than data from another group. And if you're not careful, that can lead to some seriously flawed conclusions.
So what are these sources of bias? Well, the study points to several. A person's unique physiology for one. Critically, skin tone can affect how the optical sensors work because melanin can absorb some of the light they use to read blood flow.
And even simple things like how intensely someone is exercising or exactly where the watch is sitting on their wrist can change the readings. These aren't just little edge cases. They are central factors you have to consider when you're designing a trial.
Okay, so with all of this information, the good, the bad, and the biased, how do you actually move forward? How do you use the power of wearables while steering clear of the pitfalls? Well, the findings from this analysis give us a clear 4-step playbook to de-risk your digital health strategy.
It's a really straightforward framework. First, assess the context. Use the watch for what it's proven to do well, like that AFib screening. Second, mitigate your risk by avoiding unproven metrics like SpO2 for your critical endpoints. Third, evaluate those popular but unreliable metrics like calorie tracking with extreme caution. And finally, and this is probably the most important one, account for those hidden variables like skin tone, both in how you design your trial and in how you analyze your data.
And all of this brings us to our final thought, which is a crucial reminder in this age of big data. When it comes to clinical evidence, quality will always be quantity. The promise of wearables is absolutely real, but making that promise a reality means we have to be committed to scientific validation. At the end of the day, the big question isn't how much data we can collect, but how much of that data we can actually trust.